What if Lucky Strike had never existed? Imagine a world where war didn't smell the same, where soldiers in World War II never lit a Lucky Strike in the trenches, where there was no pause in the chaos for a drag of relief. It might seem small, but it would change everything. Without Lucky Strike, cigarettes wouldn't have carried the same symbolic weight on the battlefield, and military propaganda would have taken a completely different path. Without the famous green packs swapped for white, the Lucky Strike has gone to war campaign would never have existed. That means the advertising industry would have lost one of its greatest war-era case studies, and the emotional bond between soldiers and the brand, later translating into civilian loyalty, would never have formed. This would have even altered how brands communicate in times of crisis. Without its association with patriotism and courage, cigarettes wouldn't have held the same heroic appeal post-war. Men returning from combat wouldn't have brought back the habit of lighting up a Lucky's, influencing fewer young people and shaping cinema differently. Maybe smoking wouldn't have become a symbol of masculinity at all. And 1950s pop culture would have been unrecognizable. The cultural impact would have been devastating. Classics like Mad Men, which immortalized Lucky Strike as a symbol of advertising's golden age, might never have existed. Or if they had, another product would have taken center stage. The absence of the brand would erase a powerful narrative from modern marketing history. Beyond that, without the funding from aggressive ad campaigns, many agencies might never have grown to their current size. Lucky Strike wasn't just a cigarette brand, it was a driving force behind America's creative industry. The tobacco market would have taken a different turn. Other brands like Camel or Chesterfield might have dominated, but without the same emotional pull. War shaped Lucky Strike's success, and without it, the entire industry would have been reshaped. Hollywood studios would have lost a powerful sponsor. Lucky Strike paid fortunes to appear in films, shaping behavior, dictating trends, and dressing characters. Film noir aesthetics might have looked entirely different. The fatal charm of a cigarette lit in the dark might never have caught on. Without Lucky Strike, 1950s and 60s American TV would have had fewer iconic commercials. The visual language of consumerism would have been rewritten. The jingle "Be Happy, Go Lucky" would never have been composed, and we'd have lost one of advertising's most memorable soundtracks. Magazines like Life and Time would have had less ad revenue, potentially affecting their longevity and storytelling. Lucky Strike was a cash cow for mass circulation journalism. Without it, media professionalism might have taken longer to develop. And finally, American culture would have lost an icon, a brand that symbolized rebellion, class, war, masculinity, and, ironically, freedom. A world without Lucky Strike would have less smoke but also fewer stories. Without Lucky Strike, the history of global advertising would have taken a completely different path. This brand helped define modern propaganda: bold, provocative, and emotional. In a world without it, campaigns from the 1920s to the 1960s would have been less daring, less impactful. Edward Bernays, the father of public relations, might never have had his breakthrough moment. It was Lucky Strike that hired him to make smoking socially acceptable for women. Without that mission, Bernays wouldn't have orchestrated the infamous Torches of Freedom parade, and marketing might not have become such a powerful tool for social engineering. Campaigns like Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet, which encouraged women to smoke to stay slim, shaped an entire generation's behavior. Without it, cigarettes might never have been linked to feminine elegance, and fewer women would have started smoking. That alone would have altered global public health statistics. Madison Avenue ad agencies might have taken decades longer to master emotional and psychological storytelling. Lucky Strike demanded audacity, and audacity became the standard. Without that creative pressure, the industry might have stayed stuck in literal, uninspired messaging. Radio, which relied on advertisers, would have lost one of its most loyal sponsors. Lucky Strike was among the first brands to heavily invest in radio ads. Without that funding, the medium's growth might have stalled, and many classic programs might never have aired. The visual aesthetic of advertising would have been different too. The iconic white pack with red and gold accents inspired countless designs. Its influence set trends in commercial graphic design for decades. Without it, storefronts, magazines, and billboards would have looked far less striking. Even jingles would have had a different rhythm. Lucky Strike pioneered turning slogans into catchy earworms. Without its influence, sonic branding might have evolved in a less engaging and less effective way. The psychological manipulation techniques now common in advertising were tested on Lucky Strike. The concept of manufactured desire, making consumers believe they need something, gained traction there. Without those experiments, marketing would be less strategic. To this day, psychologists, designers, and advertisers study the brand's campaigns. Without that material, modern marketing would have fewer case studies, fewer success stories, and far less history. Lucky Strike helped shape the hidden mechanics of consumption. And finally, the line between need and want might have been clearer. Lucky Strike blurred that boundary, selling products through style, status, and belonging, not function. A world without it might have been more rational but perhaps less creative. If Lucky Strike had never existed, public health would have taken a less tragic path. Millions might never have lit their first cigarette. The ripple effects would have been profound, reshaping healthcare systems and even global life expectancy. For much of the 20th century, Lucky Strike ranked among the world's best-selling cigarette brands. Its appeal was irresistible, fueled by brilliant campaigns and an image of power and sophistication. Without it, that gateway to nicotine addiction might never have opened for so many. Countless young people started smoking with Lucky Strike, drawn by its striking packaging and promises of status. Without that influence, generations might have embraced healthier habits. Smoking, once a cultural norm, might have remained a niche vice. Hospitals worldwide would have saved billions treating smoking-related diseases, lung cancer, emphysema, heart disease. The burden on public healthcare systems would have been far lighter. Medical science might have sounded the alarm sooner. Without Lucky Strike bankrolling misinformation, paying off doctors and silencing researchers, the dangers of smoking could have been exposed decades earlier. In the 1940s and 50s, ads featured doctors endorsing Lucky Strike as less irritating to the throat. That kind of deceptive marketing delayed anti-smoking legislation. Without it, global warnings might have come much sooner. The tobacco industry as a whole might never have gained the same political and economic clout. Lucky Strike was a pillar of cigarette lobbying for decades. Without it, tobacco control laws could have been implemented earlier. Global life expectancy might be higher today. Smoking kills over 8 million people annually. If one of history's biggest cigarette brands had never existed, how many of those lives could have been spared? Air quality in public and private spaces would have been better. Before modern restrictions, indoor smoking was the norm, and Lucky Strike was everywhere. Without its dominance, smoking culture might have been weaker from the start, and maybe, just maybe, our grandparents, parents, or even some of us would be living in a different reality today. One where taking a deep breath wasn't an act of resilience, but simply breathing. Hollywood would have had a different face. Without Lucky Strike, Hollywood would have projected a different image of masculinity, glamour, and rebellion. For decades, film was one of tobacco's most powerful advertising tools, and Lucky Strike was at the center of it. The brand's absence would have redrawn the aesthetic of the American hero. Imagine classic film noir without the detective's cigarette dangling from his lips, his face shrouded in thick, mysterious smoke. That wasn't just style, it was strategy. Lucky Strike paid top dollar to place its product in the hands of stars like Humphrey Bogart and Rita Hayworth. Without it, the image of lethal charm might never have been tied to smoking. In cinema's golden age, smoking was an act of power and seduction, the accessory of tough guys and femme fatales. Lucky Strike sponsored films, scripts, and entire studios. Its absence might have made room for other symbols of personality, perhaps less destructive ones. The brand's marketing infiltrated Hollywood's backrooms. Lucky Strike's agents interfered with scripts, demanding smoking scenes to keep the product visible and desirable. Without that pressure, films might have built characters with different habits, healthier, more conscious, more diverse. Cultural icons like James Dean or Marilyn Monroe might never have been seen with a cigarette, shaping a new generation's role models without nicotine's influence. Smoking wouldn't have symbolized freedom, rebellion, or sophistication, and that would have altered millions of young lives. Lucky Strike's campaigns were so well orchestrated they blurred with Hollywood's own storytelling. Instead of just selling a product, they sold a lifestyle. Without that emotional engineering, films might have portrayed addiction more responsibly. Visually, movies would have changed. Without symbolic smoke filling the frame, cinematographers would have sought other ways to convey tension, intimacy, or loneliness. Silence, lighting, or a lingering gaze might have replaced the slow drag of a cigarette. The entertainment industry might have accelerated public health debates sooner. Without Lucky Strike's weight, anti-smoking voices could have risen earlier, unafraid of sponsor retaliation. Perhaps, in this alternate world, the Oscars would have honored films that tackled addiction as a tragedy, not a style statement. The visual and narrative culture that shaped collective imagination might have been less complicit in glamorizing self-destruction. And the big question remains, how many silver screen dreams turned into silent tragedies behind the scenes, fueled by ad contracts and manufactured allure? Without Lucky Strike, maybe cinema would have saved lives instead of romanticizing their ruin. War would have tasted different. In World War II, American soldiers carried rifles, hopes, and packs of Lucky Strike. Cigarettes weren't just a habit, they were psychological armor. If Lucky Strike had never existed, the trenches would have tasted different, harsher, rawer, less numbed. The brand was key to maintaining troop morale. The US government distributed millions of cigarettes to combatants, and Lucky Strike was a favorite. Smoking was sold as temporary relief from chaos, a pause between gunfire. Without it, the military would have needed another emotional anesthetic. Their wartime ad campaigns were surgical. Lucky Strike Green has gone to war wasn't just a slogan, it was marketing genius, rebranding a packaging change as patriotism. Without that move, the emotional link between soldiers and civilians might have frayed. Without the brand, maybe veterans would have returned with fewer chemical dependencies. Lucky Strike's absence could have reduced smoking's normalization in the ranks, and later in society. The trauma of war would remain, but perhaps with less smoke around it. Cigarette companies profited massively during wars. Lucky Strike turned conflict into a profit machine. If that engine had been missing, resources might have flowed elsewhere, into medicine, or veterans' mental health. The brand's presence on battlefields wasn't neutral, it shaped generations of men. Without it, the American macho ideal might not have been a nicotine-hardened soldier with a 1,000-yard stare. Lucky Strike's propaganda tied smoking to patriotism. The line between ads and indoctrination was thin. In a world without the brand, public opinion might have turned against tobacco sooner. Maybe cigarettes wouldn't have become a war legacy passed from fathers to sons. Without Lucky Strike in soldiers' packs, American homes might have cherished healthier symbols of bravery. The public health impact would have been massive. Millions of veterans came home addicted. Without Lucky Strike exploiting their vulnerability, a silent pandemic of dependency might have been avoided. And the cruelest question, how many war heroes survived bullets, only to die slowly with a cigarette in their chest? Without Lucky Strike, victory might have come with a less poisoned future. Health would have breathed freer, sooner. Without Lucky Strike, the world's lungs might have breathed easier far earlier, literally. The brand's absence could have accelerated anti-smoking awareness by decades, sparing millions of lives. Lucky Strike was instrumental in making smoking socially acceptable, even desirable. It infiltrated homes, offices, parties. With clever, aggressive campaigns it tied tobacco to status, charm, and rebellion. Without it, that glamorization would have weakened, or been replaced by a less toxic narrative. Without the brand's influence, doctors might have spoken out sooner. For decades, Lucky Strike ads featured physicians claiming their cigarettes soothed the throat. In a world without that manipulation, medical warnings could have carried more weight much earlier. Statistics would tell a different story. Fewer smokers, fewer addicts, fewer deaths from lung disease, heart failure, and cancer. Countless families might have been spared the loss of loved ones to something as silent as a pack smoke. And big tobacco? It would have taken a massive hit. Lucky Strike was a pillar of the modern cigarette industry. Without it, rivals would have struggled to fill the void, likely with less cultural dominance. That could have weakened the entire sector. Public health campaigns might have launched earlier. With less industry pressure, no Lucky Strike means less lobbying. Governments could have banned ads, raised taxes, or mandated warning labels decades sooner. Smoking causes cancer might have appeared on packs in the 1950s, not the 60s. The post-war generation could have been cleaner, less dependent. Maybe social movements, feminism, counterculture, would have found symbols of freedom beyond cigarettes. Rebellion would have needed another icon. Lucky Strike was one of the biggest obstacles between tobacco and the truth. Without it, ignorance's veil might have lifted sooner. Medicine would have beaten marketing, science would have drowned out slogans. And young people? Many might never have taken that first puff. Without the brand's dominance in movies, TV, and streets, smoking's visual appeal would have been weaker. More teens might have chosen fresh air over filled lungs. In the end, a world without Lucky Strike would be a lighter one. With fewer muffled coughs, fewer late-stage diagnoses, fewer families broken by addiction, a world where breathing deep wasn't a privilege, just the norm. A world without a cultural icon. If Lucky Strike had never existed, we wouldn't just be talking about a missing cigarette brand. We'd be erasing one of the 20th century's most iconic cultural symbols. Lucky Strike wasn't just a product, it became language, style, identity. Without it, the world would have inhaled a different kind of influence. Think of classic films. How many legendary scenes feature a powerful, mysterious, or seductive character smoking a Lucky Strike? Without that image, screenwriters might have used other tools to convey power or desire. The lighters flicker in the dark, the pack slapped on a table, all of it might have been replaced, or vanished entirely. In TV, shows like Mad Men cemented Lucky Strike as an extension of character. It became visual shorthand. Without that reference, storytelling would have needed new symbols. Wardrobes would change, attitudes would shift, the language would differ, fashion would have taken another path. Cigarettes, especially brands like Lucky Strike, shaped entire eras' aesthetics. Ad posters, magazine spreads, even perfume campaigns borrowed smoking's visual language. Without the brand, design from the 1930s to the 70s would have been rewritten. Music would have lost references too. Songwriters, album art, artist portraits, many use cigarettes, often Lucky Strike, as metaphors for loneliness, rebellion, or decay. Without it, lyrics might have turned to other symbols, other pains, other provocations, and visual art. Lucky Strike inspired paintings, photos, sculptures. Andy Warhol turned consumer brands into art. Erasing Lucky Strike would cut out a piece of that movement. Museums and galleries would lose a key critique of 20th century capitalism. Without Lucky Strike, youth rebellion might have had another emblem. Cigarettes wouldn't have defined adulthood or defiance. Maybe it would have been a drink, a hairstyle, a gesture, something less lethal. But certainly, coming-of-age rituals would have been different. Even our idea of glamour would have shifted. For decades, glamour meant lighting a post-dinner cigarette. It meant posing with one between your fingers. It meant smiling through smoke. Without Lucky Strike, marketing would have invented another aesthetic, another way to whisper, "This is beautiful. This is elegance." The world would smell less like tobacco and leave room for other expressions. We'd watch different films, hear different songs, buy different magazines. The absence of Lucky Strike would have reshaped aesthetics and symbolism. In the end, deleting Lucky Strike wouldn't just erase a brand. It would rewrite a layer of collective imagination. A world without it wouldn't just breathe easier, it would look different, dress different, express itself differently. And maybe, just maybe, it would have understood freedom in a whole new way.